Okay, so today's session, we'll look at glandular epithelium. Last time we're looking at covering epithelium. Now look at glandular epithelium. It's the same type of epithelium that we discussed, except this time it is forming special organs in the body called glands. You can see here, these are epithelial cells, well arranged and tightly held together by intercellular junctions. Then the epithelium invaginates to form ducts and secretory portions. So when it comes to glands, there are two types of glands in the human body: exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine, glands with ducts; endocrine, glands without ducts. In addition, there are smaller glands or just groups of cells which act as endocrine glands, but their secretion acts, or their products acts on local cells. So we call those as paracrine glands. So they fall under endocrine glands. So if you like, you can say we have three, as long as you explain it in such a manner. Now, glands produce various products. So we'll see that today our focus will be on exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, we'll discuss them under endocrine system. So we're saying glands, to be specific, exocrine glands produce various products. And these products, if you look at their chemical properties, you find that they are either protein in nature, lipid in nature, or carbohydrate in nature, or a combination of the two. For example, lipid and carbohydrate, protein and carbohydrate, or simply a combination of all of these: protein, lipid, carbohydrate. For example, the breast, the mammary glands produce milk, and the milk is a composition of all these macromolecules plus water and electrolytes. For example, calcium, sodium, those are electrolytes. Now, let's look at exocrine glands in more detail. So from now onwards, we can shelve endocrine glands. We'll discuss it later. So this is epithelial tissue from which all types of two glands we've talked about originate. So this side, we have endocrine glands. We see that endocrine glands, as the gland forms, the gland detaches or separates from the epithelial tissue of origin and becomes isolated, whereas exocrine, there's always contact by way of a duct with the epithelial tissue where it originated from. So that's why we call these as glands with ducts, and these as ductless glands. Since they don't have ducts, these cells, which are equivalent to these cells here, the secretory portion, these cells are always surrounded with blood vessels. To be specific, capillaries. So capillaries act as ducts for endocrine glands, since they do not have their own ducts. And these capillaries now would transport these hormones to their target tissue. For example, growth hormone is produced from the pituitary gland, and growth hormone goes to almost all tissues in the body: muscles, cells, brain, and all organs for growth. So here we have a list of all exocrine glands, all types of glands. Now let's focus on exocrine glands. How do we classify these glands? So exocrine glands need to be classified. So we realize that there are 4 systems of classification of glands. Exocrine glands, to be specific. We look at the shape of the cell, of the gland, the means or mechanism of secretion, how is a gland producing its product, The nature of the product, is it watery in nature? Is it mucus in nature, or a combination? Then number of cells. Is a gland formed by several cells, or is a gland formed by just one cell? Like here, we see that this gland is made up of so many cells. From here up to this side, these are multicellular glands. We'll come to that soon. Let's begin with the first system of classification. This is morphology based on shape. So, just looking at the shape of the gland, we can categorize exocrine glands as follows. Number one, we observe the structure here, which we call the duct portion. Then also observe the structure here, which we call the secretory portion. So if a gland has one duct, we call them simple ducts or single gland. If a gland has one duct, we call them simple gland. If a gland has two ducts, which we're not showing here because we don't have one, if they have more than one duct, we call them compound glands. So that's the first system we look at. How many ducts are there? One duct, simple. More than one, compound or branched duct. Next is we observe the shape of the secretory portion, this part here. The secretory portion has various shape. So the secretory portion can be in form of a tube, can be in form of a cup, or in form of mixture of a cup and a tube. Let's look at specific examples for that. Okay. So this is a tube and this is a cup. So this one, which appears like a cup, we call them alveolar or acinar glands. The one that appears like a tube, we call them tubular glands. Now, if the gland is alveolar, it's more like a cup. It's either going to be single or branched. So it can be one cup at the bottom or several cups. 1, 2, 3. So this is single or unbranched. Then this is branched. Multiple cups, single cup. What about tubular gland? Tubular gland, if the gland is tubular, it can either be a straight gland, a branched gland, or a coiled gland. So this is a straight tubular gland, branched tubular gland, coiled tubular gland. You see this making this S-shaped structure. That being said, now let's try to add names to them. So we'll start with tubular glands. So tubular glands, so all of these glands here are simple glands. Simple glands in the sense that all of them have one duct, one duct, one duct, one duct there, and the duct here. Same with this one, a single duct. Single duct there. So all of these are simple glands. First of all, just by looking at the number of ducts. Then we look at the shape of the secretory unit. So this is a tubular gland. And the secretory unit is straight, so we call it straight tubular gland. Where can we find a simple straight tubular gland? These are found all over in the large intestine, small intestine. In the small intestine, we call them crypts of Lieberkühn. Straight, simple straight tubular glands. What if there are more than one tubes at the bottom of one duct? We call it simple branched tubular gland. 1, 2, 3. So these are branches attached to one duct. Where can we find the simple branched tubular gland? These are found all over in the stomach and the uterus. Okay, the uterus secretes fluid, the stomach secretes gastric juice from these glands. So these cells here in brown are the cells producing gastric juice in the stomach and fluid in the uterus, which we see as vaginal fluid, because the vagina itself does not have glands. What about a tubular gland that coils? We'll call it simple because it is one duct, simple coiled tubular gland. Where can we find such a gland? We find them in the skin. So the skin is littered with so many sweat glands. When you start running, you see that you start sweating all over on the skin because the skin is covered with these sweat glands. So we are done the tubular ones. What about the cup-like, which we call alveolar? So these are alveolar glands. Since they both have one duct, we'll call them simple. And it's just one. So this is simple unbranched alveolar or acinar gland. Where can we find such? We find them all over in the urethra, both males and females. These glands produce some mucus that protects the urethra from the acidic nature of urine that passes through it. And when the urethra has infection, these glands over-secrete that mucus. That is what we see as pus draining from the urethra in times of gonorrhea and other types of suppurative STIs. Then what if there are several cups attached to one duct? We'll call it simple branched acinar gland. Where do we find these? These are found all over the skin. Wherever you have hair follicles on the skin, these glands are there. Since we have hair follicle on the face, sebaceous glands are there. Hair follicle all over the skin, sebaceous glands are there. And that's why we see that the skin is usually oily because of the product from these cells called sebum. So that's it about simple glands. We are calling them simple because they have a single duct. What about compound glands? So compound glands, as we'll see shortly, we'll see that they're going to have at least more than one duct. So these are compound glands. But the shape in the secretory unit is the same as we discussed previously. So let's begin with the first one. We see that there's this major duct, then there are other smaller ducts. This is a duct, that is a duct, that is a duct. So 3 smaller ducts connected to one major duct there. And because of that, this gland has multiple ducts, and therefore we can't call it a simple gland. We'll call it compound gland. So this is a compound gland. Then when we examine now the secretory portion, we see that the secretory portion appears like a tube. So this is a tubular gland. So we call it compound branched tubular gland. It's branched because there are so many tubes at the bottom there. One tube, one tube, one tube. So compound branched tubular gland. Where do we find such glands? They are found all over in the duodenum. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. So duodenum has such glands. These glands secrete alkaline product or basic product because in the stomach, the simple tubular glands were producing acid in the stomach. And to neutralize that acid, we need a basic substance or an alkali substance, which is produced by the Brunner's glands of the duodenum. We call them Brunner's glands because they were discovered by Brunner. Let's look at this one now. Here we see that there are multiple ducts one main duct there and several smaller ducts connecting to it. Then we have several cups. One alveolar or acina, 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 acina. So we'll call this as compound branched acina or alveolar gland. Where do we find such glands? Example given is the exocrine pancreas. The pancreas has two parts. The pancreas is an exocrine gland. At the same time, the pancreas is an endocrine gland, producing insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin as hormones, then producing pancreatic juice as exocrine gland. The last one among compound glands is here. So we see that they have one major duct and several smaller ducts at the bottom there. But if you look at the shapes, you see that some glands are cup-like, therefore we call them acina or alveolar. Some glands are tube-like, this one and this one. So it's a mixture of alveolar and tubular. So we'll call this as tubuloacina gland. Compound tubuloacina gland. Where do we find such? Salivary glands. The salivary glands, we have the sublingual, submandibular, and parotid glands. They will be in this nature. So that's it. Classification of glands based on the first system. Looking at the morphology of the gland. You have to observe if there are one or two ducts or more, then the shape of the secretory unit. So let's look at means of secretion or mechanism of secretion. How can we classify glands based on the means of secretion? Number one, we have glands that produce by merocrine means. So when you're talking about glands focusing on means of secretion, this one, we need to, what we want to see, how are the cells behaving when secreting their product? What is happening to the cells in the secretory portion? Not here. Cells there. What is happening to them? You call that means or mechanism of secretion. So following that, we see that some glands, the cells involved in the secretory unit will synthesize that product, of course, by rough endoplasmic, smooth endoplasmic, and Golgi apparatus, make that product, and then store it in the cytoplasm in form of vesicles. When that product is needed, for example, sweat, when you're running and the body needs to cool down, that's the time we need sweat. The vesicles will undergo the process known as exocytosis. Go closer to the cell membrane and then open up, allowing the product inside them to leave the cell. So we call this process as exocytosis, meaning exit. If it's in the opposite direction, it's referred to as endocytosis. Come in. Come in. Coming back, so just pull the door for me. Thanks. All right. So that is exocytosis. Then endocytosis is the opposite direction, where substances or molecules will enter the cell in a similar manner. The moment a substance enters a cell, it is enclosed in a vesicle. So we call that endocytosis. So where do we find such cells or such glands? For example, sweat glands. Sweat glands produce their product in such a manner, and also the pancreas. Let's look at another type or mechanism of secretion known as apocrine secretion. So glands that secrete in this manner, we call them merocrine glands. What about apocrine glands? So apocrine glands, let's look what is happening to the cell here. So what is happening to the cell is the cell will synthesize the product that it needs or what the gland needs. Then when the gland is stimulated to secrete that product, first of all, the cell synthesizes and stores the product in the cytoplasm like the previous cells. But here, we see that the product that is made fills up the whole cell, thereby pushing the nucleus to the bottom of the cell. You see the nucleus was here, but has been pushed to the bottom. And then when the gland is ready to secrete, the apical portion, we discussed this under epithelial tissue, we have apical pore and basal pore. The apical pore detaches from the rest of the cell together with the secretory product that has been made by the cells. So this is called cleavage or pinching off, if you like, cleavage or detachment. Now we see that the cell here is losing part of itself compared to this one. This one, the cells remain intact, but here the cell is losing the apical part. Now, since the nucleus is still present, the cell remains alive and can be used again until the cell is finished up. So we see that the cell, the moment the apical part detaches, the cell here closes, the cell membrane closes. Where do we find such kind of glands? Number one is the mammary gland, the breast. This is a female breast here. Next, we find it in sweat glands. So there are other glands in the skin. They are called sweat glands, but they are a bit different from the other sweat glands. So we call them modified sweat glands. They are found in special areas of the skin. For example, the axilla, the armpits, the anus, and the rectum. So those are special type of sweat glands, and their secretion is in this manner. And that's why these regions I've mentioned, axilla, anus, rectum, usually has like a foul smell because of presence of this part of the cell membrane. And when bacteria acts on it or feeds on those proteins and carbohydrates, they give off that foul smell. Another gland is the Morse glands found in the eyelid. So in the eyelids, we have two types of glands, the Morse glands and the Meibomian glands. These are Morse glands. Let's look at the last mechanism of secretion. What is happening to the cells this time? So we call these as apocrine glands. The breast is one of them. The last type of secretion, the last mechanism of secretion is known as holocrine. Now, holocrine glands, what is happening to the cells is that the cells, yes, will synthesize the product and accumulate it in the cytoplasm. Then, when the gland is ready to produce its product, the cells simply burst or rupture. So we see that the cell here is ruptured and disintegrates together with or releasing the product that was stored inside the cytoplasm of this cell. Where do we find such glands? Found in the sebaceous gland, the skin. I mentioned the sebaceous gland. They are found all over where we have hair follicles. And that's why some of our friends have several pimples in the face, because when secretion from these glands is thick, is mucus in nature, and these glands are always next to the hair follicles, so they block the hair follicles. So that interferes with growth of the hair. And that's where pimples are formed, because the hair will fail to shoot out of the skin and becomes coiled inside the skin, forming pimples. So you see that these two, the cells are being affected because they are losing part of the structure. But this one, the cell remains intact. merocrine. And most glands in the body secrete by merocrine. Only a few, like we have mentioned here, secrete by apocrine and merocrine. Now, if you focus on apocrine, you see that the cell is losing the apical part. That's why once a woman breastfeeds several times, the volume of the breast will eventually reduce. And the firmness of the breast also becomes, compromised because cells are dying there. They are losing the number of cells. So the more times this woman feeds, the more they are losing the cells in the breast. Let's look at the third system of classification here, nature of product. Nature of product, we're looking at what is the chemical makeup of what the gland is producing. So we're not worried with the shape. We're not worried of what is happening to the cells. We just want to examine what is the chemical makeup of the product that this gland is producing. That being said, we have three types of glands here. The first one being mucus glands. So all glands that produce a product that has mucin, we call them mucus glands. So mucin is produced by the glands in the secretory portion. And then when mucin is about to be secreted, it becomes added up with water, process known as hydration. So after hydration takes place, mucin is now called mucus. And we see that there are various parts of the body where we find mucus, even when there's no infection. Examples given: in the trachea, mucus is produced. In the stomach, mucus is produced. In the urethra, mucus is produced. Why? Because cells there are producing mucin. Mucin is a chemical substance. When added with water, it becomes mucus. So examples: goblet cells produce mucus. Cells of the salivary glands, known as sublingual glands. These are glands below the tongue. Sublingual glands produce mucus. And that's why saliva is always slippery, because of presence of mucus. Then in the stomach, because of presence of hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong acid capable of destroying the stomach, we need increased production of mucus to prevent erosion, which we now refer to as gastritis, further causing ulcers. Other types of glands, if you examine the chemical makeup, they will not have mucin. Instead, they will have proteins. These proteins are usually combined with carbohydrates, the process known as glycosylation. Okay. So it will just be carbohydrate plus protein. Now, these products, protein in nature, are usually watery. So that's why we call it serous. So a serous fluid is a fluid that is similar to water or interstitial fluid. So it's not as thick as mucus, it's watery. So what happens is that these cells produce this, product that the gland is making, and water is added to them. And mainly because this substance is serous, no mucin present, it appears watery when it is secreted. Examples of where we can find serous glands or serous producing glands is the pancreas and the parotid gland. The parotid gland is another gland of the salivary system. Okay, just below the ear, we have parotid glands below and behind the ear. The last one is a combination now. So I want us, before we discuss the last one, I want us to observe this structure, this one, and the previous one here. So this is the same structure, except here it is magnified. Now you see that this structure here is filled with cells that are staining purple. Now, serous producing cells stain purple in color, whereas mucus producing cells stain whitish, like you are seeing here. So all these whitish spaces we are seeing are cells with mucin in their cytoplasm. Now, mucin is a fat product. So fat cannot be stained with these common stains. Fat is neutral, therefore it just remains whitish like that. But protein, amino acids, and that can be stained, and that's why you see purple all over. So the last classification under means of secretion is a combination of this one, which is the mucus producing cells or glands, and the serous producing glands. So we call that as seromucus glands. It's a gland that is producing serous fluid at the same time mucus. So we call them seromucus glands. Where do we find such glands? It's in the submandibular gland. The submandibular gland is a gland of the salivary system also, just found here at the corner of the mandible, the lower jaw. Those glands are called submandibular. Now, their product will be mucus plus serous, therefore seromucus. That's why if you see here, you see there are these white cells surrounded by purple or blue cells, meaning serous producing cells. So you see that this shape, the shape of the serous cells, they're arranging themselves, forming more like a half moon. If you follow this shape, it's like a half moon, C-shaped, C-shaped, C-shaped. It's what is explained here. So it's one gland, but with two cells, two types of cells. Some cells are producing serous, the purple ones. Some cells are producing mucus, the white ones. Hence, we call this purple color here demi-lune. Demi is half, lune is moon. So half moon or or demi-lunes. Now we'll look at the last classification system of classification, which is based on number of cells. I hinted this in the beginning. So we're just looking at the number of cells. I can use this example here. This very example. So all glands in the body, whether it is exocrine or endocrine, are made up of multicellular structures. So all glands in the body are multicellular glands because there are so many cells here. This is a duct, this is a duct, this is a secretory portion. So if you count these, there are a lot of them. It's more than one cell. So we call them multicellular glands, except for a goblet cell. A goblet cell is a single cell, but at the same time, acting as a gland. So this is the only unicellular gland we have in the body, a goblet cell. So I don't have a specific example here, but I think I'll add before sending the notes. So you see one cell there, a goblet cell. It is more like a C-shaped structure, and it will not have any other cell next to it that is similar in structure and function. It will have maybe other cells performing other functions here, but it will be isolated among epithelial tissue cells. Let me try to find a goblet cell somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't have one. So, but I'll add to the picture. So that's about glandular epithelium. Remember, we're classifying this epithelium based on shape, mechanism or means of secretion, nature of product, and number of cells. Several cells there, compound and simple glands. Means of secretion, we are looking at holocrine, merocrine, and apocrine. Nature of secretion, we are looking at mucus glands, serous glands, and seromucus glands. Number of cells, you're looking at multicellular glands and unicellular glands. Unicellular gland, example given, goblet cell. So this is where we end for today.